as the Indian budget goes, it includes very little in the addressing climate change crisis at the bottom. In India, we have invested a lot of money in actually what is called mitigation. That means putting a lot of solar and wind power, not putting that much coal power. This can go into the box of mitigation. But what we are facing as Indian population is a huge number of climate extreme events and the slow onset events, which are slowly creeping up and hurting our agricultural productivity, hurting the productivity of human beings because of the extreme heat waves and heat indexes. And the budget is extremely important in the sense that if there is budgetary provision, there are budgetary provisions to address this at the center, at the state level, and going down to the district level and block level, which actually energizes the administration to do something. Just like there is a GRAP in Delhi, the Graded Response Action Plan in terms of air pollution. If there is a kind of a plan for that, all not only the climate action plans that we have, but really an action plan to respond to the developing climate extreme events, and a corresponding budgetary allocation for that, then it will be easy and fast for any administrative machinery or any action machinery to actually address that. Like if you say we have actually a National Adaptation Fund, which invested in NABARD, being a National Implementing Authority or agency. So if any action has to be taken for giving people relief from heat waves or from a flood or from, say, a drought or from any of these climate extreme events, the only thing that the state can do is try to see where from its budgetary allocation it can take out some fund from some other head and then put something extra. And there is no provision for neither planning nor provision for putting money into that. So that's why the budgetary allocation requiring that, okay, this kind of climate extremes are needed to be addressed. And it's clear that the Indian government now knows very clearly, and this is not only from the IPCC report, this is also from Indian government's own report, own study, which was released in 2020, in June 2020 by then Environment Minister, then Earth Science Minister, Mr. Harshavardhan, which is called the impact of climate change over the Indian region. So this gives a fairly good idea which regions of India is most likely or are most likely to face what kind of climate extreme events in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And these have timelines, these have projected increases of different kind of climate extreme events. But unfortunately, our budget has not responded to this knowledge, existing knowledge. And again, not only from IPCC or WMO, from Indian government's own initiatives, and this was done by IITM Pune. So the budget is extremely important in the sense, though our budget still fails to respond to that, the budget is extremely important because this highlights that these kind of events are increasing. One. Second, these are the areas that this kind of climate extreme events are there. This kind of population, vulnerable populations do exist. They need this kind of responses. Like if a coastal population is facing repeated cyclones, what kind of additional aid you can give from beyond what is already there, the major resources already there. So in all these respects, a clear plan accompanied with a clear budgetary allocation for different kind of climate extreme events and the people who are vulnerable and are suffering. These are, I am saying again, this is very well known. This only needs to be matched in the plan and in a budgetary allocation, and this needs to translate to action not only from the central level. Today, I'll end by saying this point here, that today our action on climate extremes is extremely dependent on a centralized authority, National Disaster Management Authority. And that needs a direction from that. So it's going up, the information going up the whole chain, and the action flowing down the whole chain. It's a very slow and cumbersome process, and this results in very, very inadequate action when people need real help in terms of climate actions. In the Indian budget, the climate crisis has never actually figured prominently. We have, as I keep saying in multiple fora, the Indian budget addresses partly to our international commitments. Like India has committed that 50% of our installed electricity capacity will come from non-fossil fuel sources by the year 2030. So Indian budget has given some provisions to support that ambition. But in our ambition, uh, if anyone looks at the budgetary provisions and the actions needed and the actions that are already happening on the ground, we don't find any commitment, any pledge that India will do this much by this year in terms of adaptation, in terms of building resilience of our populations to climate change impacts or climate extreme events or slow onset events, and in terms of building people's understanding and awareness and localized capacity to respond. So the budget actually is very insensitive to the whole idea that people at every level, particularly those who are dependent on natural resource for their lives and livelihoods directly, because everybody is dependent on natural resources, but people who are dependent for their livelihoods and though live around those natural surroundings, they are far more dependent on this and they are far more vulnerable and being hit by climate extreme events and climate slow onset events. So for them, the budget has not even thought about that they need a special consideration or a provision. And this is a consistent gap. And this also comes out from India's long neglect of quote unquote the whole concept and Ministry of Environment. If we look at the budgetary provisions of the Ministry of Environment, it's just about 3,300 crores, 3,200 crores, 3,400 crores in a total budget of how much is 27 lakhs crores plus. So it's a minuscule total allocation for the entire Ministry of Environment, which includes the entire administrative machinery of CPCBs and state PCBs and all others, and the pollution control and the non-compliance cities, air pollution, etc., etc., etc. So in the Indian scenario of planning, present government as well as the earlier government, the ministry, the whole issue of environment, the whole Ministry of Environment is a very lightweight ministry. And climate change being seen as a domain of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has equally been downgraded. We know that the disaster management is in the Ministry of Home Affairs, but disaster management is seen more in terms of a rescue relief, armed forces, national disaster response force, state disaster response force. So basically a armed organized force rather than building people's capacity. So the overall the Indian budget is extremely insensitive to climate extreme events and the people who are suffering from that, and it's also insensitive to the need and the understanding that these impacts, particularly heat waves and heat indexes, are projected to rise very very fast. The extreme heavy rainfall and flooding, and including urban flooding, has increased extremely fast. So these realities are there, but the government and the budgetary provisions and the budgetary exercise, budget making exercise, seems to be oblivious of that. Indian budget is so insensitive, and the budget being insensitive starts from uh, the whole issue of climate extreme events, whole issue of people at the bottom being subjected to lot of climate extremes, lot of climate impacts. They are losing their livelihoods, losing their lives. All these kinds of things come in the news sometime, but these do not make an impact in our governance and administration mechanism. So one very clear requirement that is there is for India, take its own report. Take your own Ministry of Arts Science report of 2020. Which are the kind of areas, which are the kind of population are vulnerable and getting impacted? And this is not only vulnerable, because for the last 10-15 years, we are seeing that large number of Indian people in multiple areas, coastal areas, central Indian drylands, river valley areas, Himalayan areas, they are impacted very, very strongly. There are reports of the glacial lakes increasing by 50% in 5 years in the Satluj Basin. There are massive incidents happening of GLOF, glacial lake outburst flood. floods. There are massive incidents of coastal erosion and even entire islands disappearing in the Sundarbans. So all of these, and these are just the tip of the iceberg. So the one basic requirement, one first requirement is, let you take the Indian government, let them take their own report, map out all the areas, all the vulnerable population, and the kind of climate extreme events they are facing, and they are likely to face more and more, because these are projected reasonably well, and many of these actually match the macro study of IPCC, etc. The second requirement is, sorry, that okay, you go ahead and plan this accordingly in your central budget, because today what is happening is most of the state governments are fund short because of the centralization of GST, and GST is subject to when the central government releases their share, etc., etc. So the central budget has to play a significant role, not only for centrally sponsored schemes, but any localized demands and local schemes, local plans that are coming up from not only state level, but also from the district and panchayat levels. Because panchayats are the ones where you have to, panchayats and ward level and maybe city levels at most, you have to act actually to address the climate crisis at that locality. So there are very few climate crises that is across the nation. That do not happen in a country like India very easily, except massive droughts and heat waves. So that kind of thing has to be taken more or less at the city level or at the regional level. So the second requirement is, once you have mapped out as per your own studies, then you match what are the kind of requirements in terms of adaptation and resilience building. And adaptation, as we have seen in India, there is some kind of adaptation in terms of infrastructure, but building adaptation and capacity for local people, populations, is almost absent. So that needs to actually reverse. Along with infrastructure, people need to be prioritized for their protection. And the third exercise that needs to be done in this chain is that, based on these assessments, there needs to be a fair evaluation of what kind of budgetary allocations are needed. We understand that all the needs cannot be addressed from the budgetary allocation. There is the need of climate adaptation and climate resilience building is much larger, but we unfortunately we see very little effort from Indian government to reach out to even international events, international fora like the COP, the UNFCCC COPs. Indian government plays a secondary role in claiming or enforcing that the countries which are suffering most, the countries of the southern countries, they need a substantial climate financing. Except rhetoric, we don't see Indian government going out and establishing this very clearly. So apart from Indian budgetary provision, there should also be reaching out to other sources outside the government budgetary sources, both within India and outside. That's a requirement that is not just charity from others, it's a right because people are suffering, and it's a established CBDR and RC principle that common but differentiate responsibility and respective capacities. Out of that, it is coming. The very principle of climate justice. So if we now leave out the resources that can come from outside, there are resources like the adaptation fund. Most of it is channeled through NABARD. So from the budgetary allocation, this third part is extremely important, that once you have mapped out, once you have assessed, then evaluate what kind of budgetary allocation, and budgetary allocation can then leverage some other funds from other sources. These three can be matched, and then based on this, allocations can be given for the district level administration to immediately reach out and respond. But along with that, a proper response and reaction plan has to be also there, because if in case of a climate extreme events, you don't have time to send it up to the national level and then get approval, the process of approval, and then through the whole chain, the fund allocation and the action plan is approved and it comes back to the district level, and then the action starts. By that time, it is quite often very late. It's too late. So this all these have to be devolved to the lowest level, possibly, if preferably, if possible, to the panchayat level. But everything may not be possible to be devolved. The climate action, everything cannot probably be devolved into the panchayat level, but at least to the district level, empowering the district level administration, creating a capacity at the district level to respond to climate extremes, and enabling that mechanism which is knowledgeable enough, which has equipment and which has knowledge how to do, enabling them with the financial resources from the budgetary allocation so that they can respond almost immediately. So these are requirements for our nation to respond to increasing climate extreme events and its vulnerable population suffering massive losses. Otherwise, we'll keep increasing our losses and we'll try to swipe them under the carpet, because India, also international India, plays a big don. We are a big power. We don't need external support. We are not suffering. We can take care of our own losses, kind of thing, like India did in the case of the 2013 Uttarakhand disaster, like India did even earlier 2018 Kerala disaster. External aid was refused, showing our own evolving power, and we have arrived in the world stage. So if we keep taking this kind of a stance without giving safety, security, and some kind of resilience building within the communities, then the losses that Indian people suffer, particularly in the vulnerable areas, and these vulnerable areas have increased over the last several years, particularly all along the coast, the so-called 7,500-kilometer coast, all along the 2,000-kilometer plus Himalayan areas, and a large part in the river valleys. So these areas cover something like 35 to 40% of India, and particularly the entire Gangetic Basin and the southern peninsula area are extremely vulnerable, and these are becoming more and more susceptible to heat waves and heat indexes. So these areas need urgent and substantial budgetary allocation and substantial administrative machinery which is knowledgeable enough and equipped enough and enabled with the budgetary allocation to respond to them. Otherwise, our people's misery, suffering from climate extremes, and the losses that we suffer, the losses and damages that we suffer will keep on mounting at exponential rate.